The Crusades, spanning from 1096 to 1291, were not merely military campaigns. They were complex socio-political phenomena that reshaped the medieval world. Among their most significant consequences was their profound impact on the economy of medieval society. The interplay of war, religion, and commerce introduced new economic dynamics that resonated across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. This narrative explores the economic effects of the Crusades, interwoven with the lives of fictional characters to illuminate their influence on society. In the bustling port of Venice, a merchant named Matteo stood at the docks, overseeing the loading of his ships. It was the year 1202, and the Fourth Crusade was underway. Matteo's fortunes had soared since the First Crusade had opened new trade routes to the east. The demand for ships, supplies, and financing for the Crusaders had turned Venice into a hub of economic activity. Yet Matteo's wealth came at a cost. The deals he struck were often shadowed by uneasy compromises, as the line between piety and profit blurred. The Crusades spurred economic growth in ways Matteo could not have imagined a century earlier. The wars required vast amounts of resources: arms, horses, food, and transportation. To meet these demands, the agrarian economy of Europe began to shift. Lords leased their lands to peasants for cash to finance their participation in the Crusades, fostering a gradual move away from feudal obligations and toward a market-based economy. In Matteo's world, money replaced oaths of fealty as the currency of power. While Matteo prospered, others felt the strain of the Crusades. A young farmer named Alric, living in the rural heart of France, struggled to pay the increased taxes levied by his lord. These funds were intended to outfit the lord's retinue for the journey to the Holy Land, but for Alric, they meant fewer tools and seeds to sustain his family. The economic burdens of the Crusades fell unevenly, often heaviest on the peasantry, who bore the costs without sharing in the rewards. Yet, the Crusades were not solely a drain on resources. They also created opportunities. Alric's neighbor, a blacksmith named Gerard, found his craft in high demand. Knights needed armor and weapons, and Gerard's forge became a vital part of the local economy. The war had created a cycle of production and consumption that touched even the smallest villages. Trade, however, was where the Crusades had their most transformative impact. Matteo's ships sailed to Constantinople, Alexandria, and Acre, carrying not only Crusaders but also goods like silk, spices, and glass. These luxury items, once rare in Europe, became increasingly accessible, fueling a growing demand. The influx of Eastern goods enriched merchants and introduced Europeans to new tastes and technologies. This economic boom was not confined to cities like Venice. In towns across Europe, guilds began to form, regulating crafts and trades to ensure quality and fairness. The rise of these guilds reflected the growing importance of commerce in medieval life. Matteo, a shrewd businessman, understood that trade was the lifeblood of this new economy. He invested in warehouses and secured contracts with Crusader states, ensuring a steady flow of goods to and from the east. But the benefits of trade were not evenly distributed. In Constantinople, a trader named Leontios watched with bitterness as Western merchants dominated the markets. The Crusades had brought wealth to his city, but at a cost. The Venetian merchants had used the Fourth Crusade to sack Constantinople, leaving the Byzantine Empire weakened and vulnerable. For Leontios, the Crusades were a stark reminder of how economic ambitions could overshadow religious ideals. Back in Europe, the wealth generated by the Crusades began to transform society. Banking systems emerged to support the complex transactions required by long-distance trade and war financing. In cities like Florence and Genoa, families like the Medicis and Fuggers laid the foundations of modern banking, creating institutions that could lend money to crusaders or fund new ventures. Matteo himself relied on such banks to finance his trading expeditions. The economic changes brought about by the Crusades also had unintended consequences. The influx of wealth widened the gap between the rich and poor, fueling social tensions. In Alric's village, resentment simmered as the local lord returned from the Crusades laden with spoils, while the peasants who had funded his journey continued to toil in poverty. These disparities would eventually contribute to the social unrest that marked the later Middle Ages. For Matteo, the Crusades were a source of both opportunity and peril. As the 13th century progressed, the stability of the Crusader states began to erode, threatening the trade routes that underpinned his business. Matteo faced difficult decisions. Should he invest in securing his own fleet of armed ships, or diversify his ventures into safer, more localized trade? The uncertainties of war were as much a challenge for merchants as for knights. By the end of the Crusades in 1291, the economic landscape of Europe had been irrevocably altered. Feudalism, while still dominant, had been weakened by the rise of a cash economy. Towns and cities grew in importance, driven by trade and industry. The Crusades had acted as a catalyst, accelerating changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the modern era. Matteo's story ended with a bittersweet legacy. His family's wealth ensured their prominence for generations, but the losses he suffered during the fall of Acre reminded him of the fragility of fortune. Alric and Gerard, too, saw their lives shaped by the Crusades, their village gradually transformed by the economic forces unleashed by the wars. In this vast and interconnected world, the Crusades were more than battles for the Holy Land. They were battles that reshaped economies, societies, and lives. For better or worse, they left an enduring legacy, one that would continue to influence the course of history long after the last Crusader had laid down his sword. Shifting trade networks. Matteo's descendants, having inherited his thriving Venetian enterprise, expanded the family's reach into new territories. By the early 14th century, the Venetian and Genoese republics had become maritime superpowers, dominating Mediterranean trade. The Crusades had opened pathways to exotic goods, silk, spices, sugar, and fine ceramics, that continued to pour into Europe despite the waning of Christian control in the Levant. Matteo's grandson Giulio was acutely aware that Venice's wealth rested on its ability to maintain these trade routes, even if that meant dealing with former adversaries. By this time, the Christian Crusader states had all but collapsed. Yet the demand for Eastern goods remained insatiable, compelling merchants like Giulio to forge alliances with Muslim traders and local rulers. In cities like Cairo and Damascus, Christian and Muslim merchants negotiated deals that transcended religious divides. Such arrangements revealed an enduring truth of the Crusades. While war had been the original motivation, commerce had become its enduring legacy. One consequence of these thriving trade networks was the growth of urban centers. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Marseille flourished, attracting artisans, merchants, and laborers seeking opportunity. Markets expanded, and guilds gained prominence as urban economies diversified. The wealth generated by trade also spurred cultural investments. Giulio himself was a patron of art and architecture, sponsoring the construction of a grand basilica adorned with mosaics inspired by Byzantine designs, symbols of the cultural fusion born of Crusader interactions. The financial revolution. Meanwhile, the financial innovations necessitated by the Crusades had evolved into powerful instruments of economic growth. Banking families like the Medicis and Fuggers built upon systems first developed to finance the expeditions to the Holy Land. Letters of credit, originally devised to enable Crusaders to travel without carrying large sums of gold, became tools of international commerce. The concept of risk-sharing partnerships, essential for outfitting Crusader fleets, evolved into joint stock companies. In Florence, a banker named Lorenzo, whose family had long been involved in financing Crusader ventures, recognized the potential of these financial instruments. He expanded the family's operations to include loans to monarchs, funding wars and territorial expansion. Lorenzo's ambitions, however, came with risks. When Edward III of England defaulted on loans during the 100 Years' War, the resulting financial crisis highlighted the precariousness of such ventures. For the common people, the financial changes of this era were a mixed blessing. Peasants like Alric's descendants found themselves increasingly integrated into a cash economy. While this allowed some to purchase freedom from feudal obligations, others fell into debt, vulnerable to the whims of markets and landlords. The transition from subsistence farming to market-oriented agriculture introduced opportunities and hardships in equal measure. agricultural innovations, and rural life. The Crusades also indirectly spurred agricultural advancements. Alric's grandson, Henri, worked on lands that had benefited from the introduction of techniques and crops learned from the East. The heavy plow, crop rotation, and irrigation systems improved yields, while new crops like rice, citrus fruits, and sugarcane began to appear in Europe. These innovations increased productivity and, over time, contributed to population growth. Yet rural life remained fraught with challenges. The economic shifts brought by the Crusades had weakened feudal structures but had not eliminated them. Henry's village still answered to a lord, though the terms of their relationship had changed. Instead of laboring in the lord's fields, many peasants now paid rents in cash, a system that mirrored the broader transition toward a market economy. Henry's family managed to save enough to buy a small plot of land, a testament to the opportunities the Crusades had inadvertently created for upward mobility. The rise of commerce and a new middle class. By the 14th century, a new social class, the bourgeoisie, was emerging in European towns and cities. Composed of merchants, artisans, and financiers, this middle class owed its rise to the economic transformations initiated by the Crusades. Giulio's family, though still deeply tied to Venetian trade, diversified their investments, funding ventures in textiles, shipbuilding, and even the burgeoning printing industry. In towns like Bruges and Ghent, textile production boomed, fueled by the wool trade and financed by merchants who had profited from Crusader-era commerce. Urban workshops became centers of innovation, employing skilled laborers who benefited from the protections and support of guilds. These developments marked a significant shift in medieval society, as power began to shift away from the landed aristocracy and toward the urban elites.